Okay, so this is your first lesson of the week beginning the 20th. So for some of you, this is the lesson that you will have on a Monday, but you might have missed it because you're at the psychology conference. I know that means you've been doing loads of psychology, which is great, but I still don't want you to fall behind with what we've done in lesson. Or it might be that this is your Wednesday lesson because I'm not available, so I'm pre-recording it. Okay, so make sure whatever psychology group you're in, you've watched this or engaged with this lesson before Thursday. Okay, so the retrieval, what I'd like you to do, and I said I would do this to follow up our previous lesson. Do you remember we pulled apart that 16-mark question on the problems of diagnosing schizophrenia, so all those issues of reliability and validity? We pulled it apart and we created our list. What I'd like you to do is to have a go at that as an 8-marker. We've done this before. Try not to rely on your list and your notes too much. See how much of it is still up there and can be retrieved, and write me an 8-marker. So give yourself 10 minutes for it. So that's 10 minutes of the lesson, and then I'll collect them in when I see you on Thursday, I think, or at least arrange for them to be marked and reviewed. Okay, so 10 minutes, pause this and have a go in your book, okay, or on paper, but it will need to be handed in. Okay, so having done that, lesson title for today will be biological explanations of schizophrenia. So we've worked out what schizophrenia is, what the positive and negative symptoms are, how the DSM defines it, and some of the problems with comorbidity, symptom overlap, gender bias, cultural bias, the fact that the DSM says one thing, the ICD says another. So we've thought about the problems associated with defining it, but now we're saying, okay, we're pretty certain this person A, has got schizophrenia. Now, how do we explain why they have it? What is the cause? Or the etiology is a fancy word. It begins with an A, even though we pronounce it etiology. So the cause of the disorder. So this is where we put our biology heads back on. And we say, okay, well, when we've looked at the biological approach before, when we did psychopathology, or when we were just doing our approaches work at the very beginning of year 12, we said there were big ideas when it came to biological approach. One of the big ideas is that our behaviour can be explained by our genetics. So we use twin studies, we look at concordance rates, we try and identify whether there's a particular genetic explanation. We said that another big idea was neurotransmitters, or here on the screen you'll see I've called it neurochemicals, but those are things like dopamine. Dopamine is the one that we're focusing on for schizophrenia. And whether we have too high or too little, too much or too little of those affects our behaviour. And we've seen that before with serotonin and OCD. And then our neuroanatomy, or on the screen there we're calling it brain structure. So the actual regions of our brain that we now know so much more about. Now we've done our biopsychology module, but maybe specific areas being damaged or hyperactive, inactive might explain it. So what we'll do when we're looking at the biological explanations, we'll take those in turn and look at, well, where's the evidence? Is there evidence that there's a genetic link? Is there evidence that too much dopamine causes it? How much do we trust that evidence? So we'll be evaluating it as well. There is a Masalit video on this too, this exact issue, biological explanations for schizophrenia. So again, that is recommended to add to your understanding, to consolidate this lesson, is that Masalit lesson too. Okay, so let's have a think then. We know, and again, if we're in class, I'd have given you a sheet to do this, but it can still be done as a thought exercise. This was taken from the online textbook, but you've also got all of these terms and keywords broken down on your knowledge organizer. Okay. So we know that when we're thinking about biology, we look at genetics. We know we've got that difference between genotype and phenotype. And we know that when we want to investigate whether there is a genetic link or an explanation for something, we use certain types of studies. So again, pause the video, have a think about those series of questions on that slide there. So how do we investigate whether there's a genetic explanation? What types of studies do we use? There's 4 different types of studies. Rack your brains. What's our little word formula for phenotype? What are concordance rates? We did this just last week. And also just last week on our retrieval was this idea of the diathesis stress model. So what did we mean by that? Okay, retrieve your knowledge, jot it down or say it to yourself, check you know it before you move on. So pause the video and do that. Okay, so let's review. So if I want to check, and this is going to be the sort of evidence we're looking at for schizophrenia. If I want to check whether there's a genetic basis for schizophrenia, I'm going to look at family studies. I'm going to look at twin studies. When I'm looking at both of those, I'm going to be looking at the concordance rate. So in what proportion of cases where the mother has schizophrenia do her offspring, do her children? In what proportion of cases where a brother or sister, a sibling has schizophrenia, does the other sibling? Not twins, if I'm talking about family studies. I do the same with twin studies, and we know with twin studies we like to compare concordance rates of monozygotic twins, identical, where they're 100% genetically identical, with dizygotic, non-identical twins, where they're 50% genetically identical. So we know we look at twin studies. Adoption studies, because that's a brilliant way of separating nature-nurture, isn't it? If you are biologically inheriting the genetics and mum had schizophrenia, but you're taken out of the situation and adopted into a non-schizophrenic household, but then you still go on and develop schizophrenia, that's a good argument to say it's nature, it's genetics, not nurture. It's not learned behaviour. It's not because of the way you've been brought up in this schizophrenic household. It's actually because it's something in your genes you've inherited. So adoption studies. And the 4th one we haven't talked a lot about before now, but genetic mapping. Now we can very cleverly marker genes, and we can see whether there are certain genes which help us to build up a picture of a disorder. Okay, our little word equation then, phenotype is genotype plus environment, so that leads to the expressed characteristic. And linked to that one, the diathesis stress disorder is a model or theory which recognises that role of genetics, but also that there's then that interaction with the environment. There's those environmental stresses, that's the stress bit, which makes it more likely to be expressed, so the phenotype. So if we think about schizophrenia, you might have a genetic vulnerability genotype, that's the diathesis bit, and then certain stresses in life, certain experiences, lifestyle choices you make, add to that and might make it more likely that you end up with schizophrenia. Whereas someone else could come along who has the same gene, but they don't end up with schizophrenia because their lifestyle choices and their environmental stresses were different. Okay? And a reminder of the concordance rate, so the proportion or the probability of that 2 people will express the same behaviour. Okay, or the same phenotype. Okay, so that's a reminder of when we're interested in genetics, the sort of words, the sort of terminology we are using. So this is just a screenshot, but I've attached this to class charts. So what you've got is you've got a sheet with lots of pieces of evidence. They are all linked to this idea of, is there a genetic explanation for schizophrenia? So there's lots of new names, but remember what we've said, we'll learn as many names as we can. We'll keep trying to come back to them, but as long as we have got the research to refer to. If we, in the exam, we forget the name, we can survive. We just want to be able to refer to the research. So what I'd like you to do, you won't be able to see it off there, using the attached sheet of research, and also thinking about these 2 links here, which is some more recent research, because I always think it's important for us to have the most up-to-date recent evidence. I'd like you to create yourself a set of notes. So some brief notes, and that will probably take you till the end of the lesson to do so, because remember you've already spent 10 minutes, haven't you, doing your retrieval. You've listened to me witter on for 10 minutes. You've had a few pause points to check and remind yourself of some of the key terminology. So now I would say you've got about 20-25 minutes left, and I want you to spend the time using these 2 links, using that research sheet, using the Masalip video, your topic companion. Oh, sorry, you haven't yet got your topic companion yet, have you? But you've got access to the online textbook. So use all those sources of evidence to create yourself a set of notes. And the way I would arrange the notes if I were you is to say evidence for genetic explanation, evidence against. Okay? So you decide when you work through that sheet of all the studies, is that evidence that yes, there is a genetic explanation for schizophrenia, or is it evidence to suggest no, there isn't? So you're starting to evaluate, you're starting to think that through. Then we'll pick this up in lesson on Thursday. We'll quickly check that you're all okay with that, and then we'll think about another aspect of the biological explanation, this idea of the dopamine hypothesis. So I want you confident on the genetics bit at the end of today's lesson. Okay? Give me a shout if you need anything. Email me. Of course, I'll get back to you. Okay, thank you very much. Hope that's all clear.